This morning, or earlier this week, I decided we'd just ride and you too, because you kind of have to take a break from Matthew for a few weeks. And I thought about this in light of current circumstances going on in our country. I was thinking, I guess, when I started this whole thing of the recent pandemic and people's various responses to it, the government's responses to it, some of which are kind of disturbing and perhaps unjust. And it's been a major change just in that regard alone, to think that a whole state can be shut down just like that is something I've never experienced before in my life. The idea that you must stand 6 feet apart from one another, wear masks, the idea that you can distinguish between a business that is essential and one that is non-essential, when the non-essential businesses incur just as much commitment and passion and dreams as anything else does, and that they can be shut down, and in a lot of cases simply destroyed because of that. The idea that you can have streamlined church services instead of gathered church services. Quite frankly, this is more of a significant social change than I have ever experienced in my entire life, and I just turned 71 last week. So that's some years, you know. The only time I can think of anything comparable to it was in 1967, when I entered boot camp for about 9 weeks. But I knew that was going to end. Okay, and so I had an advantage, whereas here, this is kind of off the table. And now recently with these riots around the country because of this incident in Minneapolis, again, just the spontaneity of it all, or apparent spontaneity, makes you want to think, okay, what does it mean really to submit? What does it mean for me as a Christian, as a citizen, to submit to my leaders when they seem so clueless as to what's really going on and taking such hard-handed approaches to things? I mean, the virus thing alone, why is it that we're the only, in the Abundant Life, the only 2 churches that have been meeting throughout this month here, when it's been legal for anybody? Presbyterians and Methodists, Lutherans have not met. Why? Well, I think it's because they actually believe some of this stuff. I mean, if I thought for a moment that, by meeting together, we could give one another Ebola or the bubonic plague, I'd be a little, resistant to this idea too. But with a virus that is simply inconsequential to 90-some% of the people that get it, and the people that are receptive to it are in nursing homes or could be protected that way, I don't care if I get it. I mean, I do. I don't want to get sick. I don't like to get sick. But I really don't care. I don't think it's a life and death matter for me. I could be wrong, but I could be wrong about that with pretty much anything. I take off down the road on a Tuesday night trip down to middle Iowa and over to the west, and I could die. One time I did have an accident. But I don't think I'm going to die. I take off. So what, how do we as followers of Christ handle all of this? How do we handle our fellow citizens? But I'm thinking more in these sermons about how do we handle those in authority over us, our governor, our president, our Congress, people that can make laws that reflect us. So this today and the next 2 Sundays, I thought I would just deal with this. So today we're going to talk about just biblical teaching on submission, and particularly to civil authorities, but as application to a broad variety of things. And then next week is particularly as manifested here in America, because it's not the same to submit to a czar as it is to a constitution. And so I think we need to keep these 2 things in mind as we think about how we should respond to authority here, because the question of who is an authority is kind of prominent. And then lastly, given us, and even given harder circumstances, say outright blatant tyranny, how do we, as a follower of Christ, deal with it? So we'll deal with these in the next weeks to come. Today, what does Scripture teach on Christian submission? The classic passage When it comes to civil government, is Romans 13, so I'm going to read the first 7 verses. We're not going to treat all the verses, but the first part of this we will. And Paul says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all your due, taxes to whom taxes are due, custom to whom customs, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor."
Let's pray together. Our Father and God, we read your word and pray that you would help us to understand it and see how it applies to each and every one of us as we seek to live our lives responsibly in your presence. For we do thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So again, we're focusing here on civil government. There are other forms of government in terms of ones that have been, in some sense, ordained by God. We can think of church government, we can think of family government, but there are others as well. Even a 4-H club have rules that you're supposed to abide by. There's some order there. And so it's any social group, business. So we're going to focus on civil government, and the one thing that sets civil government apart, all these others, they have the power of the sword. It's serious business here, life-wise. They can take your life, justly, in their mind. So, Paul says that everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. I point out here, he's talking about authority, civil authority in general, not any particular one. The strong will dominate without them. So anyway, regardless here, there are 2 basic views held by Christians as to what this passage means. I've held both over my life, okay, so I don't insist on anyone agree with me here, but I think it's a conversation that we do need to have. It's some things that we do need to think about. Because you're going to find people on both sides of this issue. Most Christians today, I think, will hold the view that I'm going to describe first. Okay? And that is the view of an unqualified submission to the governing authorities with the acceptance only of the gospel of Christ. Anything else they tell you to do, if they tell you to do it, if we don't do it, we're being unrighteous. Okay? And if we do it, we're being righteous, even if it's not a very good thing. Okay? I mean, this this view is developed when you, from the standpoint you think how to defend it. Well, all civil authority results from God's providential decree. And that's true. But then so does everything else, including unjust rebellion, also results from God's passive allowance of it to happen in this providential decree. So all persons must be subject to the prevailing governing authority in order to be subject to God, even when that governing authority defies God in certain senses. When we cannot submit, we must allow ourselves to be persecuted. Passively submit and trust God to deliver us in His timing with no effort on our own. He will bring it to pass. And sometimes we must say this is the only option we face. When you have nothing to resist yourself with, and they have a determined enough approach, you will end up being persecuted. It doesn't matter. The point here is that God is sovereign and will work His will even through evil rulers, as they were when Paul wrote this. I am only called to submit and only passively resist in an unjust state. Righteousness just is obeying the rules, not pursuing right relationships. Follow the right rules. And this is, I will point out, there are 2 ways of looking at the universe, and we in the West tend to err on a false side. You can look at it as a legal universe or as a personal universe. Well, it is obviously from Scripture a personal universe with a legal category, but it is not a legal universe. So if you obey the laws, you can still be very unrighteous before God. Okay. And you can be righteous before God and make serious mistakes on keeping the law. Okay. So as we think about this, one criticism, other criticism that should come to mind is this doesn't just call those of us who are ruled to be submissive. Rulers must be submissive as well. The divine right of kings has been a teaching in the church throughout the Middle Ages, and some are close to holding it today. But this is the view that even evil kings, because they are kings and put there by God, simply must obey. You must obey. I think this all confuses God's providential will with his effective will, what he wants done, as opposed to what he allows to be done. Deuteronomy 29 tells us that the secret things, which is the providential will, belong to the Lord our God. But the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law. Unqualified submission denies our responsibility to discern God's effective will. It makes a person into a stick or a stone in God's program. It denies us of the consequences of our free choices. And it misunderstands grace as being something that you simply, to honor God, you simply allow him to come upon you and do something rather than meeting him and then doing and cooperating with that effort, which is what grace actually is. It's a power. This view is generally used, I would submit, as a smokescreen to evade hard thinking on particular issues and easy, that is, unthinking obedience. As long as you are obeying the king, you are righteous before God. And that, quite frankly, is false. You need to understand that. Now, a more biblical view of this passage, and the one that gave rise to America in the first place, is more of a responsible and reflective, and I would say a lawful understanding of submission to God. Again, we need to remember that Romans 13 here is part of the Bible and not part of the federal code. Okay, that's important. Okay? In other words, it's God that gives it its authority, not the federal government. It's not an end in itself. Civil government is not self-initiating. It is responsible to the one who has initiated it, who is God. The civil government, no matter where they are responsible to God. Paul places civil government firmly under God's jurisdiction. The authorities that exist have been established or ordained by God. Now you ask, what about those who reject God and deny him? Well, they are also responsible to submit to God by virtue of their creation, whether they agree or not, just like people. Now, in the Old Testament, God required Israel's leadership, civil leadership, to comply with his law. And I think, boy, this would be great to see put back in place, to be quite honest. I can't imagine this happening. Just think about it. We've just elected a president or a governor or whatever, and this is what we require them to do. It says, and it shall be when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the priests and Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. I think that's would be a very profound amendment to our Constitution, actually. I wouldn't mind insisting on reading the Constitution, too, okay, because that's what they take their vow to. I think this is, it really would be incredible. I think it's really a step in the right direction. Nations as well as individuals are required to submit to God's moral law. Foreign Old Testament Gentile nations were judged for breaking these same commandments, as was Israel in time. There's a difference between what we consider natural law and revealed law, but both from God. And we need to remember that. Romans 2 talks about what we might think of as natural law. Again, there's all kinds of views on this. But it's essentially what you can know about what's right and wrong, something about being alive, okay, as opposed to what you read anywhere. It says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things of the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. So, again, Scripture doesn't invent natural law. It simply refers to it as part of what it means to be created in God's image. This submission to God's law, to God, is not because God is a tyrant. It's because we are ontologically tied to Him as our Creator. Life apart from God is death. Love for God issues in obedience, which enhances life, not death. Moral law is like commanding me to take a breath of fresh air. Why wouldn't I do that? Why would I need a law to tell me to do that? Adam and Eve chose to breathe foul air. Thus they died. They chose to do that. And it turned out poorly. And ever since then, God's quest is to bring the people He created back into that living, breathing, life-filled fellowship with the triune God. And this is what the law is central to it. And again, there's greater responsibility in the ruler's submission than to the ones who are ruled. Luke 12 says, for everyone who has been given much, with authority, much will be demanded. And the one who has been entrusted with much, much will be asked. So, putting yourself in a position of leadership is putting yourself in a position of increased responsibility and potential judgment. So, our submission to the state results from our prior submission to God and is qualified by that. The same thing is true with a husband and wife. There's such a thing in the Scriptures as lawful divorce. Okay, that is there. It's nobody's perfect will, but it is certainly there because the obedience of a woman to her husband is not unqualified. If that husband should decide, well, I'm going to send her out to prostitute herself to support the family, she has every right to say no. And if need be, to divorce her husband at that point. Although they had that right in biblical times. But that would certainly be justified. In submitting to government, we should think of ourselves as submitting to God. And if we cannot submit to God by submitting to government, we should resist. But that's something that calls for reflection, calls for thinking, discerning, things of that matter. So, the Christian, in other words, does not desire to resist authority. He must kind of be pushed into it. He desires peace. He desires right relationships. And if the only way to get that is by pushing into a form of resistance, then he must be prepared to be pushed into that. What then about rebellion against civil authorities? Can you think of the war for American independence? We'll try to work through that here. And continuing in Romans 13, it says, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. All of us may kind of want to rebel against the government. I don't think many of us want to rebel against God. So we should give us some pause to think about these things. Verse 3 says, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. So, who is the one in rebellion in an anti-God state? Is a question you can ask. What is it to be the response? What is to be the response of lesser magistrates in this whole matter? I would submit there's a difference between rebellion and resistance, and that resistance isn't interested in turning things over. They're interested in limiting evil to support the good. To rebel implies a radical defiance of all authority, not a principled stand against an authority which has rebelled against God. To resist a higher authority gone rogue can be an act of submission to both God and to it as a governing institution. No authority is higher than the authority which ordains them. God is the only self-initiated authority. He simply, his existence lies within himself. It says he will bring, by doing this, by defying an institution which God has given us for our good, will bring judgment on ourselves. That's what chaos is. That's what it is. And we must also say that a wicked state is probably easier to live under than a stateless society in a wicked world, where the strong dominate and have their way. Ordered, resistance is an act of last resort, but they're certainly described in the scriptures. Think of the midwives at the time of Moses' birth, Rahab, David, Daniel, and others clearly were examples of resisting authorities above them, including civil authorities. There is no requirement for unquestioned submission. And to think that you're obeying God by unquestioningly submitting to civil authorities is to make a serious error. We cannot, without sin, challenge the fact of authority in any lawful sphere, but that brings with it the responsibility to act rightly. We obey civil government as God's servant, not as our sovereign, especially so here in the United States. The civil government is to recognize and protect our rights, which we need to remember are also responsibilities. Everybody talks about unalienable rights, and they talk about government giving them and government taking them away, and that's just false. Okay? The unalienable means simply we're never given; they've always existed. They're being water. Okay? And it's not just us that have them. The Mexican down in Mexico has unalienable rights. So does the Chinese and the Russian and everybody else have unalienable rights. But their government will not protect them, will not endorse them. So they suffer persecution. And we could be heading down that same road. We have to quit thinking about our rights are something that our government gives us. They do not give us those rights. Those rights are ours by virtue of being created in the image of God. So that's something we need to straighten out our language about. Only Jesus is sovereign. Philippians 2 says, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. In the early church, the big contest was the two proclamations: Caesar is Lord, or Jesus is Lord. And they did contradict one another. And when we say we submit to Caesar, we are only doing so as an act of submission to Jesus. We don't submit to Caesar because Caesar tells us to submit to Caesar. Okay? It's an important distinction to make. When the governor tells us not to meet as a church because of health reasons, she can make that statement, but it's up to us as whether we are to obey it or not, because we are under Christ's authority before we are under her authority. And so we need to make that judgment. And we may agree with her, but if we do, we don't do it because she tells us to. We do it because God has told us to. We don't want to get suckered in just to be rebels and be fashionable. Sometimes our leaders do make wise choices, and we should listen to them. But it's our choice. It's our responsibility to make that choice, and not theirs. So again, the consequences to a state's defiance of Jesus are serious, and we are in the midst of that. Psalm 2, therefore you kings, be wise, be warned. You rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry with you, and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The state that abuses God and his law and enslaves people unjustly or kills them without cause will be enslaved itself by God and will be exterminated. Rebellion is rejection of God. Okay, obedience is accepting of him. Wrath, I just read this past week. Wrath is the love of God in action. I found it very intriguing. Because you think of wrath and love being contradictory. But they're really not when you think about it. Why is God upset? Well, he's upset because we're making such a mess of things. He created us to be so full of life, you know. Yeah, we're destroying not just ourselves, but things around us. How could he not be a bit irritated about that? Okay? And he loves us. I had such high expectations. He's like raising kids, I suppose, to a certain extent. You know, you have high expectations. Well, hey, you never met those expectations either. So, I mean, some parents want their kids to be everything they want them to be, and that's a lot of burden on somebody. I won't be perfect, you know. So, but wrath is the love of God in action. We were created to be a part of God's triune fellowship of joy, goodness, and love, and yet we persist, like Adam and Eve did, in killing ourselves. He will permit it. We are created in his image with wills that he has decreed will make a difference. And as another person said, hell is the best God can offer for those who hate him and themselves. That's just where you're going to have to end up. Now, thinking about this, again, Paul wrote this letter when Nero was the emperor of Rome. And you think about evil governors, well, Nero's right up there. I mean, you know, Genghis Khan, yeah, he's pretty bad. Hitler, Stalin, but Nero also, right there. You know, Trump's way down here. Okay, as bad as he might be, you know, he's still nothing like Nero is. So we're not that. He was the emperor of Rome. So what does this turn all this on its head? I mean, Paul thought we ought to obey even then. Nero persecuted Christians terribly. Yet there was no resistance. Well, two things I'd say. First of all, Romans was written, I think, in about AD 54 to 57. Nero reigned from 54 to 68. And Nero's early reign was much milder than his latter reign because he was under advisors up until he was maybe 17 or so. Persecution of Christians as a result of Rome's burning started at 64 AD, and Nero's reign was much worse in these later years. That's one thing. But secondly, you know, this was a new faith. Christians were just starting out. We had made many inroads into the institutions of society. The church alone was something we were working on and creating. There was no apparatus for a rebellion against Caesar that would have come close to working. We hadn't filtered out into, they were beginning to. There were individual soldiers coming to Christ, but as far as enough people in power to begin to turn these institutions on their head, as indeed eventually did happen, we were not even begun there yet. So we need to also remember the Christ kingdom is not advanced by resisting by armed force, even if that is allowed in some cases. The Christ kingdom advances by loving submission to Christ and our fellows, and it may not be possible to love others without resisting them in their rebellion. Okay, so we submit when it is called for us to resist the state, as it may be. We do that because we love them, and we love God. Okay. If you can't do that, then you better not be resistant. So, in summary, individuals and lesser governments are to submit in descending levels of authority, beginning with God and on down the institutions that he has put for our welfare. Again, when a government which is there for our welfare, to emphasize the good and resist the bad, begins emphasizing the bad and resisting the good, you got some real problems here. And this is a real mark. Like I said, Paul's statement here is to authority in general, not to a particular instance of it. You have to use your head about that before God. That if the government begins to call evil good and good evil, something needs to, their resistance is called for, even if it's just you know, and you'll be killed, of course, but it's still, you know, a a country like the United States, we're supposed to have the apparatus to actually forcefully resist these matters in a responsible and godly way. Okay? So we've come a long way from there, but I'm not at all convinced we could do it today. I don't think we have the moral base for it to do it. We need to work on that. We submit to God first, and in submitting to God, we submit to those He has placed over us. All human authorities are responsible to submit to God. Those who do not will bring judgment upon themselves, like a fish who decides to live outside the water. You freely choose to do that, death will follow. God leads us to that. When higher authorities rebel against God, lower authorities are to do everything possible to protect the people from this death and body rebellion. But the purpose is not to overthrow, but to restore and to honor God and them. We do not honor our earthly kings by allowing them to be fools when we have the means to prevent it. And for America, if there is no return to the truth of theology, moral law, and I would say even now science, because I think truth has degraded so far. What do you have in the media today when it comes to theories about this virus? What you have is one theory being elevated in the realms of power. Every other theory that comes to contest it is squashed. That is not truth. That is power in display. Because there's more than one theory to explain how people get sick. And our government has employed one. And that one may bring with it something like mandatory vaccinations, which could kill you. Because I don't know what they're going to put in that vaccination. I know they want people under their control. So, we need to return to an understanding that truth does exist, that there are things that we can know. And if we substitute power for these things, we are lost. Even if we win, we lose. Okay. We will bring judgment upon ourselves. But we should take hope, because America is not omnipotent. But Christ's kingdom is. And our one and only hope is the latter. I am a follower of Christ before I am an American. And everyone else must, every other Christian, ought to be willing to subscribe to that. And if they do, we're pretty safe right now. Unfortunately, that may not be the case. But I hope it is with us. I really do. Let's pray. Father and God, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you that, Lord, you have not left us alone in our sin and rebellion, but you have come. You have come and made the way plain, Lord. You have sent your Son to die for our sin, to die in our place, to die as an example of what it means to follow you, Lord. We just pray that you would come upon us as individuals, us as local communities, as broader nations, countries of the world. Lord, we know that you desire to draw people to yourself. We pray, Lord God, that you would simply send us forth as your witnesses and ambassadors for Christ. May we have the courage to bear witness to the truth of your word in every aspect, to all those you bring us to. And we pray we might be an encouragement to people and a blessing to them. We pray you would give us wisdom as to how to think and how to react and respond to those issues that may come forth during times of crisis as we face today. That in our response we may honor you, that we may glorify your name, and we might do good to those before whom we live, even to those, if need be, we must resist. So we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.